And at its core, the Westminster system separates the legislature from the police force from the courts. And part of the origins of why EA becomes that blocker is that the EA thinks they're all three. They get to write the rules, they get to police them, and they get to be the courts that make decisions on whether to bypass them or not in certain cases. Well, there's a word for that, and it's a dictator, and a dictatorship, and it never works.
Today on Factory Fireside, we're joined by Smyth, the Chief Executive and founder of Fragile to Agile. Now, as a data and AI person over the years, I've come head-to-head with enterprise architects on many occasions. To be honest, I don't really know enough about the enterprise architecture function and what they do, and today was my opportunity to sit down with one of the OGs of enterprise architecture and ask all the questions that I needed to know about enterprise architecture, and more importantly, how data and AI people effectively work with enterprise architects. Welcome everybody to the next instalment of Factory Fireside. We're super lucky to be joined by Smyth today from Fragile to Agile to talk about, for the data and AI practitioners in the world, how to effectively work with the enterprise architecture function within an organization. Having been a data and AI professional for many years, I've encountered enterprise architects on many occasions. Now, we tend to find enterprise architecture a little bit rigid, a little bit bureaucratic, and a little bit hard to move at the pace and innovation that we as data scientists like to do within an organization. On the flip side of that, we think that enterprise architects probably see us as a little bit cavalier, spraying technology all over the organization. Is that a shared perspective?
Well, at the danger of sounding like a media-trained politician, great question, Peter, to start off your first fire question. I'm afraid, and it's going to be, I expect, a recurring theme through this chat, that I'll differentiate between the general implementations of enterprise architecture and how Fragile to Agile view it and how we do it. I guess part of the hint is in our name, Fragile to Agile, and one of the things that we did was set up was to make a business more agile, and if you're going to do that, enterprise architecture has to be more agile. But I'll talk about, I suspect, the problem you're generally talking about, which is that in far too many organizations, EA practitioners, or the practice itself, depending on the size of the organization, can be blockers, let's call them that, because that's what they often can be, where they view their role effectively to be primarily about control and governance. And the reality of that is it does slow everything down. That, in our view, is absolutely the antithesis of how EA should be done. An enterprise architecture is fundamentally about driving change in an organization. It is what it should be about. I mean, as a simple analogy, enterprise architecture is town planning for an organization's business and IT systems. And you don't plan for today, you plan for the future, and you plan what that needs to look like to control that. Now, there has to be a little bit of control. You don't want chaos necessarily when an organization comes in, but our role should be to enable change to be done fast, but safely. There's an old silly story about why do they invent brakes for a car? Well, the answer is they invented brakes so cars could go faster, not slower, but the crew would be go faster safely. So a good EA enables an organization to make change quickly, but protects itself from things that could potentially endanger the entire organization.
Yeah, great. And so, look, I'll recant a story from my days as well. One of my first experiences with enterprise architecture. You go into a new organization, you've got to stand up a practice, you've got to build a technology platform. You get the idea of, okay, we're agile, we want to move fast in the organization. Here's the 120-page design document you need to complete to move forward for your technology platform. Let's play that situation back again. I've been charged now with championing AI initiatives and data programs within the organization. I'm in there, clean slate. I need to build the strategy. I need to set up my technology platform. I've got to build capability in terms of people and an operating model around all those things. In that scenario, how would you advise a person in that situation to most effectively work with the enterprise architecture function?
To answer that question, one of which I'm going to slightly struggle with is in the sense if you go into an organization which has, I'm going to call it, an old-fashioned enterprise architecture approach, those sort of dictatorial enterprise architects who want to control everything. I don't necessarily have a magic panacea for you there, other than to try to convince them to change their ways, which is not easy. But usually in those organizations, frankly, the enterprise architecture function is the first thing to get killed when they come under pressure anyway, because they won't see it as adding value. But I talk about how it should be done properly or done well in an organization. We're very much of the view of what we call principles-based governance. And again, I'm going to use an analogy here. It's the easiest way of explaining enterprise architecture. People often forget that the origin of the word governance is the same as government. I think we'd agree, though some American colleagues might disagree, but that the best, or I'm going to call it the least worst system of government we've come up with yet, is the Westminster system. And at its core, the Westminster system separates the legislature from the police force from the courts. And part of the origins of why EA becomes that blocker is that the EA thinks they're all three. They get to write the rules, they get to police them, and they get to be the courts that make decisions on whether to bypass them or not in certain cases. Well, there's a word for that, and it's a dictator, a dictatorship, and it never works. So when it's done well, EA, it is effectively principles-based. So you might have some principles covering data, security, and some of the other domains of design, but they should be, first of all, high-level principles. So the second point is people get confused about EA between principles and standards. So they start going in saying, oh, you can only use .NET version 2.0, or you can only use these particular protocols for data, etc. In our view, that is not an enterprise architecture function at all. That is down, there's a role for it, but it's certainly not the role of enterprise architecture or town planning. Again, if you look at the analogy, a town plan sends the building codes, that this is what the building codes they need to adhere to so that this house fits well into the overall town plan. You don't build a 20-story building right next door to somebody's little 2-story house and destroy their views, etc.
Better versions of that.
But, you shouldn't get into controlling what is the building codes, the building standards. Are we according to the right materials? Or that is a completely separate role and function. But assuming you do play just in the principles at the building code level, it should be relatively easy for a data person like yourself to come in, because we would say, let's say it was an organization where Fragile to Agile had established the enterprise architecture, we would say to you, here's a set of principles for data and security. They're probably the two that are biggest influence in the work you do. Of course, there's integration and process and other things as well. But in those two, it's simply, here's a set of principles. Providing you adhere to those principles, you are free to innovate to your heart's content. Considered as we call it freedom within boundaries. Yeah. We actually borrowed this from a large institutional bank, one of the most successful banks in the world that we work with, because they use that in their portfolio management, and it's the core of their success, of why they are so innovative. They just say, here are the rules for what you can trade and can't trade, and here are the limits we might put on. Other than that, you do not need to ask for permission at all. You are free to innovate. Yeah. So done right, and I realize that that's rare, and you're certainly a candidate rare, but done right, EA actually does give you the freedom to innovate and for you to come in.
Yeah, absolutely. And just to, I guess, unpack that a little bit further as well, I think the line gets blurred a little bit as well, as that how far does the role of EA extend in terms of technology, strategy, people, operating structure? Is it fundamentally about technology and how that fits into the organization, or does it extend further beyond that, up to strategy, down to people? If we're thinking about capability, I know you're the champion of capability models. Just for the...
Again, there are different views of this, and in fact, unfortunately, it's one of the biggest, so we call it the argument of architects, that's occurring in the internet at the moment. Certain people, and I would call them the older-fashioned view of EA, is what we call EAIT, that their view that enterprise architecture is just about technology. That is not our view. Our view is that enterprise architecture includes, of course, the technology architecture, but also the business architecture and the people architecture, though I'm never a fan of the word architecture when you put it around people, but it covers the entire organizational design. It includes things like user experience design, process design, value stream mapping in the business architecture space, business security design, which is different to technology security design, but also then includes integration, solutions, architecture, data, and all those technology domains, because fundamentally EA is about aligning those three domains of design. And actually it should be aligning those three domains of design with the business strategy, both aligning to and driven by the business strategy. In terms of EA's role in the business strategy, no, we don't develop the business strategy. That is an enterprise architecture's function. But what it is, a value add, and a very strong value add for enterprise architecture, is to provide the executive with more accurate data to make true data-based decision-making as opposed to gut feeling. So when we've established EA in some of the more mature organizations, our role is to provide these concepts called insight maps to the executive that it helps them make better decisions on where to invest and what their strategy should and could look like. But we don't get to own that. If you want to own the strategy in an organization, become a CEO, not an architect. You'll get paid more money anyway. So you might as well go there if you're going to take that risk. So we inform strategy and help them make better decisions, but not responsible for it. And then we establish the target state and the vision for business people and technology architecture, and then the principles around it. One little catchphrase that we like to use is EA has two value propositions. One is to help make sure you're doing the right things, which is our helping them make better decisions on where to invest. But then the second part is make sure you're doing those things right.
Yeah.
Which is more that principles, governance, guardrail.
Yeah. And just to kind of keep going down the chain a little bit on that one as well, is that, if I'm trying to build my program within an organization, I've got alignment with where the organization is going strategically. We've got an idea of the technologies that we want to drive within that. If I'm trying to drive my program, should it be a kind of side by side with the, like in a well-functioning, high-performance EA function, when I'm thinking about capability like people and org design and things like that? Because if I look at the world of AI, now everybody's trying to push AI initiatives into their organization right now. The problem is that it's not one data scientist, right? If you want to be able to do these things strategically, you're going to need this type of technology footprint to do that. But you've also, to make it work, you've got to get the right skill sets, and you've got cloud engineers, you've got data engineers, you've got AI engineers and data scientists, you've got all these other DevOps and capabilities that need to come in to support. Is that something you should be working with the EA function to help round out, like the capability and how it supports the tech and the enterprise?
Good, you're asking some fabulous questions, Hippie. Look, the first thing to say is that EA is not actually responsible for detailed organizational design. Okay, that's not its role to be able. But it is its role to ensure that it happens when it's necessary to happen. So, for example, when we're developing whole of organizational transformation roadmaps, which is our sweet spot, we don't only do that. Of course, we come in and help people establish EA and do, EA for a particular problem or initiative. But if you look at our sweet spot, which is these days to be called digital transformations, but we've been doing for 15 years, and we've always called them business transformations. I kind of think the word digital transformation is a bit redundant. I mean, who's going to do an analog transformation in 2025? But parking that issue, when you're doing these whole of organizational transformations, we pride ourselves on looking at not just, okay, what new tech do we need? What processes are we going to have to change? What changes are needed in our value streams, etc. But if we're going to execute those, then what are the prerequisites we need, both in terms of enablers? So we might go into an organization and they find, they don't have an integration platform, or they don't have a process automation platform, and they're the technical pieces. But we'd say, if you're going to adopt that, you need to change your entire skill set in IT, you need to change your IT operating model. So we will put on our transformational roadmaps those activities and do the high level design that says you need to change IT's operating model, or you need to change skill sets. Like, we're working with a large medical research company currently in Victoria, for example. And as we design their transformation roadmap, probably the first 6 months of that is going to be getting their house ready. What in this particular case, we're calling this phase digital readiness, because they're just not ready to execute it. And we do find some of our competitors, that's all they give you is a tech roadmap. And then they go and try and execute it and go, we haven't got the people, we haven't got, we just assume we have DevSecOps or these type of things. And one of the debates that does get involved with that, by the way, quite strictly, and again, it's a little bit implied in our name, is, where should you adopt waterfall? Believe it or not, despite Agile being a name, we do think occasionally there's a case for waterfall projects, but most projects these days should be run Agile. So adopting Agile in an organization is something that we would typically have to make some significant people and process change up front before you go into execution.
Yeah.
And that's absolutely required. But again, to be clear, it's not an EA's role to actually go in and do that. If you're doing that, you're not doing justice to your real job.
Yeah, right. I just want to sort of change gears a bit. Now, one of the bits that I know is either frustrating, intimidating, or challenging for a lot of data professionals is the architecture review board.
Yeah.
Done well, done bad. Often for me, it's like you talked about, like the government, the arbiter of like you may not pass type philosophy.
Not pass.
Type philosophy in there. Um, I got lots of architecture review boards now with like clients, and we're putting our architecture in and we're trying to move through. Almost every organization does it differently. And you'll have some that are small and a concise collection of decision makers that seem to be agile and get things done. And you have some that meet every week and they have 50 people on the call. What should an architecture review board look like, and what should its function be?
Brilliant. Again, this seems to be all 2 to 3 part answers. I don't know, it's an emerging theme. But first of all, I'll go to agile delivery, in which case, and I'm going to be very hard, there is no place for an ARB at all. So we helped, and I wish I could mention its name, but we're not allowed to talk about it in public, but we work with a very large US retailer who's famous for being agile. I might give you some hints. And you better not mention the word ARB or architecture review board or anything like that in that organization. Now, they don't adopt SAFe. They have their own approach to how they do agile at scale. But SAFe, in fairness to it, has its own way of representing this, and I don't want to get into debate whether SAFe's any good or not, or we'll lose the whole of the rest of this conversation. But in both of those models, they had one thing in common: is there is no ARB, there is principles, and then the architects participate in the delivery teams. They are there as a member of the Scrum team, and they are applying the principles agilely. As by the definition of agile, it's people over process. And so the important thing is that they're there armed with these guardrails, and as you're doing your sprints or your divide session, they're there working with the externals and yourself, saying, okay, the design needs to hear this. So you can't do that. You need to do this. And so it's all happening at the same time, and you have no ARB to go through. So you'll love that.
I've never seen it.
Yeah. No, and look, in Australia, I have to say, there's only 2 or 3 organizations I've ever seen who's got to that point. And frankly, they're the 3 we've worked with to establish that. But there are still cases, as I said earlier, for waterfall projects. And because that naturally is a more stage-gated process, then in that case, you do produce designs in a sense of a documentation. And again, of course, back in the Agile one, there is no large-scale documentation. Again, it's people over process over documentation. Doesn't say there's no documentation, but it's nowhere near as onerous. But in the waterfall model, first thing I'll allude to, you mentioned, is this concept of submitting a 250-page document to the ARB. That is, in my view, is that the ARB's actually getting into more solution design governance and not enterprise architecture governance. So that's the first fundamental fault in organizations that set up an ARB that works that way. When it works well, for example, now there might be other aspects in the document for design, and I'm not going to go into those in particular, but when it comes to checking, do I adhere to the enterprise architecture principles at the ARB, we would typically simply have an appendix in that document that is the list of principles. And all you have to do as a designer is go, I adhere to it, I adhere to it, I adhere to it, I adhere to it, and that's it. To the point that even in waterfall organizations that are more mature, we've managed to get that ARB shut down, and they have allowed the solution architects to self-assess. As long as we adhere to these principles, we tick them, we don't have to go through an ARB. Now, for that to work, there has to be some consequence. In this particular organization, it was a financial services organization, and 20% of the people's pay was down to a bonus, or at risk, as they say in financial services. And so we made that entire 20% down to whether or not their designs adhere to the principles. And that makes them laser-like focused on making sure their designs adhere to the principles of 20% of their pay is at risk. And so in that scenario, you can shut down the ARB entirely, even in a waterfall model, and just get them to self-assess. Now that's nirvana, very difficult to get there. But when you do get there, makes your life easy as an external.
But it's a great message, like up the chain. If I'm a CIO trying to run a broader function, and we'll talk about AI and stuff like that, trying to move fast and get things done, that seems like a really practical recommendation to senior leaders out there in terms of how do you move at the pace of today's innovation, right? You kind of move away from that rigid structure of, and I went through the situation once of having to build a platform, and we had to engage someone. They did a solution design for us, came back with their 100-page document, and then I had to translate that into the architecture review board for architecture review board, exactly the same document, and it just took forever, right, to get there. But that sounds like a really good recommendation for a lot of our, CIO type of IT, GM type level people of the way to think about ARBs to keep things moving.
Many of them don't operate without principles at all, in which case they are basically a police force or a court operating without law. And if I can extend that analogy, it means everything is being debated again from scratch, and there's everything becomes again like precedent law. You just go through these debates over and over and over again, and it's brutal.
That's cool. I mean, so that's clears a lot of stuff up
Mm.
for me, because like you think about like the principles-based approach, and you often get the argument from people respectfully
Yeah.
that enterprise architecture produces a document that doesn't reflect production, right? I put it in, I've gone through, and it just doesn't reflect what's actually there. But under a principles-based approach, it's, well, you're defining what it is you want to do, and then you're adhering to that in a set of principles. And then you've got a bunch of downstream capabilities that will make sure that you continue to operate within the guardrails of the organization, security, audit, all those types of things. So it's not enterprise architecture's job to make sure that 6 months down the track that you're still adhering to the principles, right? You've got downstream functions. Is that correct, or is that kind of...
Exactly. And in fact, again, I'll go back to the town planning analogy. You know, the idea that an enterprise architecture has a view of exactly how everything is in production is not relevant right now at this point. There are some cases for that, but it's not an enterprise architecture function per se. You know, again, if I do the town planning, all I need to know is that all the houses, I live in Henley Beach in Adelaide, you know, they recently, about 5 or 6 years ago, passed a law, which I'm very pleased with, that nothing above 2 stories is going to be within 3 streets of the beach. I know you live yourself there, which is basically, sorry for the Adelaidean connection for people looking for insight, it's basically we don't want to turn into Glenelg. You know, we don't want these giant buildings everywhere. Now, that's all we should be interested in as the town planners, the enterprise architects. I don't need to know what exactly the house at 300 Military Road looks like, or the houses here. All I need to know is it's under 2 stories. There are 4... there's, I think it's 1.5 meters between them and the border of the next house, so you don't disturb them. They're the things I care about, not what that house looks like, or that people going to be continuing renovating the house inside.
Yeah.
Why do I care?
Now, great analogy. Just to keep moving. So one of the other things that we're seeing a lot at the moment, there's this, and I'm sure every week you're talking about AI. Everybody wants a slice.
Oh,
right?
my God.
The tone is coming down from, board and executive down to the business end.
Often with very little understanding of what they mean.
Absolutely. Everyone just wants a slice, right?
Yeah.
Because they saw it on LinkedIn, or they went to a conference and saw
Yep.
these amazing things that somebody's doing.
Yep.
Now, when I look at the landscape, so coming through, if we go back through the original days of data warehousing into big data, into like that idea of, build it and they will come, a good old sort of field of dreams analogy there, that like, for me to get started, I'm going to have to build a technology platform and a capability before I even sort of start get moving on here. So that's one extreme. Is I go, if I want AI, I'm going to have to go and build myself an ecosystem that enables me to do that, right? The other extreme is, bugger that, I'm just going to go and get something, and I'm going to do something, and I'm going to get maybe like an external consultant to come in and help me do that, and I'm going to move forward under that way.
And ask for forgiveness rather than permission.
So I'm keen to get your views on both, but maybe starting with the first one there, in terms of people proposing, in absence of robust initiative, long-term thinking, this idea of going and building a monolithic ecosystem to deliver AI. How would you advise an organization about that?
Well, there's a few different ways to respond to that. First of all, I do get my funniest question I keep getting asked these days about how buzzy it is in the last year. The most common question I get is Fragile to Agile now going to consider enterprise AI in its transformational roadmaps? To which my response is always semi-jokingly, we've been doing it for 15 years. Why are we going to stop now? Yeah. So I'll differentiate before, traditional, let's call it traditional or old-fashioned AI, the machine learning, visual, spatial stuff, and this new, natural language processing, large language models, AI. Of course, they're a bit of a game changer in the sense that they open up a whole raft of new capabilities to which you could deploy AI, which weren't available prior to that. But, I look at old-fashioned AI in that sense that we do it. There's 2 models for doing it, if you like. And one, which only really works in the bigger organizations, is to have a dedicated innovation space and one outside where you can go and play. Then there's the issue of how do you, once that works, get that into production. We'll come back to that maybe later, how you get out of those pure innovation sandpits, for want of a better term, and then moving into production. But I talk more generally about how AI and how we're acting, particularly to this large language model, natural NLP type, without mentioning product names, my view of AI. We have a view that every organization should always be looking for opportunities to deploy what we call new technology enablers. And we would have said the same thing about blockchain or other things in the past. Any of these new technologies should look at and say, is there an opportunity for us to deploy in our organizations? And it should be looked at in 2 lenses. And we do this part of what we call our AI accelerator service. You look at where can we deploy this quickly and relatively safely? And there's a pile of techniques that would require understanding of the capability model to understand how we do this, and it's probably too detailed for here. But you'd always look for opportunities to say, we can safely get some quick wins here with this new technology. It's not customer facing in the back office. We are reasonably confident of the quality of the data, or the quality of the data is not so important in this one. But then you should also be taking a more strategic view. Where is the place where we can get really serious, advantages or benefits from this AI? But if we're going to do that, we've got to get our data sorted right. We've got to get a few other things in place first. So I says my simple way of answer is every organization should always have, I know Gartner calls it bimodal. We actually prefer trimodal, or at least 3 speeds of operation. And so AI can operate at any of those speeds. And for different use cases, different speeds apply.
Great.
If that helped.
Yeah, for sure. And let's talk about I'm going to move fast and I'm just going to do stuff, right?
Yeah.
And so, we had Nicola Dorling on from Group CIO from Downer last week, and talking about the proliferation of applications and how hard it is as a technology leader to manage this massive portfolio of different applications in an organization. And so you don't necessarily welcome people just going and randomly picking a whole bunch of new tools to do things. A lot of that, and I want to move into this space here because there's a few areas I want to unpack on this and get your perspective on it. The counter alternative to building your monolithic ecosystem is, I'm going to do a proof of concept.
Yeah.
Now, in the AI space, about 80 to 90% of these things never reach production. There's lots of reasons for that, right? It could be the absence of alignment with a useful business outcome. It could be you just don't have the technology to take it forward. It could be you don't have the skill sets within in-house to do it. It could be you've got a third-party consulting house has come in and built something with technology you don't have, with skill sets you don't have, and left you with something you can't get to production. Right? No length beyond the actual POC itself. Now, it's really encouraging that the market is embracing AI. I've been through all the cycles, and this is probably about as rapid as I've seen it. But I'm also really concerned about the way a lot of people are just diving into these POCs with very little alignment.
Yep.
A limited view of life beyond the POC, and it's kind of falling apart. As a senior technology leader, but also as an enterprise architect, is if someone's bringing that to you, how would you advise them in that situation when they go, I've got this great idea, I'm going to do this, I'm going to move fast, and this is what I'm going to do? How would you think about that? How would you challenge that? And how would you make sure that's set up for success?
So, first of all and I will perhaps have to unpack a little bit how we do assessment for readiness. So unfortunately, for people who aren't familiar with the concept of capability-based architecture, a capability model is a model of what an organization does. It's the most powerful tool in business architecture, and therefore, in our view, in the whole of enterprise architecture. But a capability, in simplest definition, is a combination of people, process, data, and technology. So we would always look at a capability anyway, and look at it as part of the maturity assessment for an organization to understand are the people, the data, the process ready in pre-AI. Let's forget AI. We add 2 new dimensions when we're looking at the capability assessment when it comes to AI, and that one is going to be no surprise. At the ethics one, is this just because we can doesn't mean we should. So we would have a look at it from an ethics perspective, and then a risk. What is the risk of actually deploying AI in here? And those combinations give you opportunities, first of all, to identify places where those experiments are slightly more likely to succeed. I'm not saying we're going to get anything like 100% success, but you're going to get, to your original question was how do we reduce the level of failures, down from that 70 or 80%. So you would try to, I guess, without over-engineering this, analysis paralysis is a recipe for disaster. It would take us no more than a week or 2 to do this analysis across the whole organization's capability to give them an idea of you're more likely to succeed here than here. So, experiment there. Second point I'll make is actually there's nothing wrong with having a lot of AI initiatives not get it into production. Go and try it, fail fast is the mantra here, and go and have a look at it. It's a bit like venture capitalists. Most venture capitalists, 80% of what they invest in loses money. But then is the 1-2 that really make big money. And so I actually don't think it's necessarily a bad thing, providing you're learning from those experiments, doing those experiments and those proofs of concepts, and then not bothering to learn from why it didn't work, and then going another one and finding it failed for exactly the same reason is a bit nuts.
Can I just dig into that
as
well? And I just want to maybe sort of challenge the fail fast idea here. If you're a massive organization, you've got huge cash flow, maybe you're okay to burn
Good point.
250K or 500K. but a lot of organizations, like we're in Adelaide, South Australia, we're in Australia. The idea of burning cash on POCs that are ultimately not going to get there, under what parameters would you say that's okay?
Well, first of all, the first thing you take is exactly the organizational's financial capacity and also general change capacity to be able to do that. Now, we're not going to be recommending, go and try 20 experiments in an organization that has 50 people, good luck. We said you broke, so you do need to be sensible and pragmatic about it when you do it. I have to say we are a little bit skewed in the sense that we work with a lot of much bigger organizations, not just within Australia, but we work with some of the largest corporations in the Philippines and in the Kingdom, in Saudi and in UAE. And to them, particularly working in the Kingdom and in the UAE, $100,000 experiment they learn a lot of from AI is not considered a waste. It's a rounding error. I think I have that in my back pocket, semi-facetiously, but there has to be a reality, learning in some CEOs that sometimes spending money to learn where it doesn't work is valuable. And to save yourself a problem,
do you think
you got to control it.
Do you think that's a shortcoming of planning, or do you think that's an outcome of failure?
I think it's an outcome of leadership training, and I have to say it's particularly probably prevalent in the government sector, where the idea of a project that didn't deliver something being considered a complete waste of time is super prevalent. It isn't necessarily, now again, at scale.
Yeah.
You go, well, waste $1 million, so he's going to be looking for your head. But experimenting in some area and learning something. Now, ultimately, if those learnings, the shortest answer to do it is they will learn. They will be convinced over time if after one or two of those failures, you then have a big win.
Yeah.
At that point, they'll go, oh, I don't really mind those $10,000 that we lost over there because I've got my, $500,000 saving over here. So there is a little bit of that has to go through. But failing, obviously we prefer not to, but the reality is with these brand new techs, what's your alternative? To stand back and wait for perfection? Yeah. If you do that in the fast-moving AI world, one of your competitors is going to eat your lunch because they've done a couple of quick experiments, then found something that works. The next point I'll make is, if they are thinking they can put their head in the sand and ignore it and just be too risk adverse, which we do see in some of our organizations. Oh no, we won't go anywhere near AI, particularly modern AI now, if I call it that. The reality is, if you think it's not happening in your organization, it is. There's a famous case for a large government department in Victoria quite recently where they were very nervous about doing this. And in fact, one of their employees just decided to get a Copilot, feed what was a whole pile of incredibly personal data and medical backgrounds and all sorts of stuff into ChatGPT. Let's make a brand name, so it could write a summary report for them. Now, that was horrific. That exposed some pretty private data with all of their background details. So even from a security perspective, never mind privacy, it was horrendous. That person was instantly fired.
Yeah.
But that was a result when they asked that lady why they did that. They said, well, I'm seeing all my colleagues working elsewhere using AI, and we're stuck in the past here, and nobody's letting me give me guidance. So I just decided to ask for forgiveness, not permission. In that particular case, it was a big problem.
Yeah, and that's an interesting. Just sort of, and I'm kind of going off schedule here a little bit, but that's I'm good with this. It's one of those things that the conversations I'm having kind of at board and executive level, there's a lot of that. Is the definition of unlocking AI is, access to Copilot or, OpenAI or something like that. And that's maybe what they understand it to be. And that's fine. But there's also this enormous amount of, unknown, what it means, where's my data going? If I put it up here, what happens? Is it, there needs to be an executive board education program that gets people comfortable with these things?
First of all, there is a lot of lack of knowledge, knee-jerk reaction that comes from senior level people. Oh, I've heard about AI. Why aren't we doing AI yet, etc. And jumping around without really understanding what it actually is. And I liked your comment about, to many of them, that's just letting our people use ChatGPT or let them loose on Copilot. And first point I'll make is actually, to be honest, at the point we are today, what I'd say 12 months into this absolute revolution from LLMs and PLM, we have not yet can point to an actually really successful use case in an organization we've worked with. Or in fact, we've been searching across the world, and you can't really point. And here's a really good use case in a business where they really achieve something great through that one. However, we've got dozens from old-fashioned AI, where we can point to how, visual recognition software, or my favorite is one from a food producer in the Philippines, where they managed to, and I won't go into detail how they trained the model, but they managed to teach a visual piece to recognize whether a pig was going to get sick or not. And they'd walk him through a gate, and just by learning from an old gentleman who'd been working with pigs for 80 years and could literally look at a pig and go, sick, well, he trained the model, and then they've saved vast fortunes, because setting off a pig to get the right vaccinations, etc., when they're sick, or, production has saved them an enormous amount to do that. And so there are loads of successful use cases for traditional AI. But LLMs and natural language processing, I'm not really seeing any yet, to be honest. I'm sure they're coming. I'm absolutely sure they're coming. Oh, great. Excellent. I'd like to see some. My view, personally, probably a little bit off script again, but you give me permission, is, we have seen success in what I'll call small language models, where organizations have taken their own internal and built their own language model and their own stuff. One of our largest alliance partners, for example, has 100 years worth of proposals, etc. A work that they've done on developing responses to tenders. They fed their entire thing into their own internal language model and all of their stuff, and they've had an enormous uplift directly from being able to use that to fast track proposal responses. We've seen 8 like this before. Here's the thing, and help them write it. But I differentiate that from, should we say, the external facing ChatGPT, or dare we say DeepSeek, but these public, running on the public large language models, from building your own. There's a fabulous company, not only yourselves, by the way, are doing great work in this space, but there's quite a few other innovative small Adelaide companies starting up, one looking at building one that's just for people working in law enforcement. So it's only going to take internal data from the law enforcement agencies, which under no circumstance you can put in the public cloud anyway, and using that and running it across theirs. And there, it's still in infancy, but that has some great hope.
Yeah. Oh, fantastic. Coming through the machine learning days as well, right? Like, it took a long time for the guardrails of production to come into place, about your ML ops, monitoring your models, having inference running, stability. That took a long time, and a lot of people just never got there on that. And the generative AI is still the same. Like, we're into agentic frameworks, and there's a hell of a lot of infrastructure and guardrails and evals and that you have to run to make this stuff work. And it's quite naive when you think that I can just go into a tool and drag and drop and away go, and I've got it's not the case, right? Yeah. There's so much other stuff that goes into getting a sustainable, reliable solution into production. And I think it'll just take time. It's the practitioner's knowledge of how to effectively use it within an organization. And you take the big product companies out of the equation, right? Most organizations only have a handful of data scientists or AI people, if they're lucky.
If they're lucky, yeah.
That have the capability to be able to do this. So there's a learning curve, and it'll just take time for people to get there in that. But I'm an optimist, Glenn. I know that we will get there. I'm still very optimistic about the fact that this wave, the agentic wave, will have the biggest impact that we've seen in innovative technology for some time.
I 100% agree. And again, 2 answers, one straight, one slightly tongue-in-cheek, but I often get we work a lot with engineers, and quite a lot of architects actually come from an engineering background, and they usually talk about the fact that we're quite immature in comparison to engineering, which has got all of these frameworks and all this. But to which my response is, well, engineering was 350 years ago, and of the first 100 years, half the buildings you built fell over because you didn't have figured out all the proper codes, etc. I said, we're only 50 years as a technology, as an industry, and in enterprise architecture, 20 years, maybe 25, depending on your position of how long it is. And the innovation and speed of change that we have to deal with in the last 50 years, and change is getting faster, not slower, as you just alluded to, was very different than engineering. The building innovations that we're having over 100 years, we probably deal with in 3 months, that level of change today. So are we still playing catch up? Are we still trying to keep ahead of this and rushing? Yes, it's always going to be difficult for us in technology. If you don't like change, and if you want to be consistent, find another job. That's right. Because you're just going to be used to this level of change. It's just what it is. Yeah. Look, and some of them will find, I had somebody say to me, I think it was only last week when I was down in Melbourne, that they, this person obviously very negative in AI, and I couldn't disagree with them more, but they said, oh, this AI is just going to be like blockchain. You know, there's all this hype about blockchain, was it 3 years ago, and how it's going to change the world and all that. And it frankly has not found too many use cases. And his argument was AI is going to be another blockchain. Now, I fundamentally disagree. I think this is a completely different ballgame than blockchain, which had a very narrow set of use cases in the first place. The real thing of these new AIs is that, in our language, the number of potential business capabilities to which they can be deployed is almost infinite. So is the whole company.
100%. Blockchain for me, most disappointing commercial technology of the last 4 years.
Yeah.
Now, best case I ever heard talk about that, I went to the Global Food Safety Conference, and I think it was the guy from one of the big retailers, and they were looking down the barrel of going down a blockchain for, you know, farm to fork.
Yeah.
And the guy was like, we've spent 20 years building this, and I can tell you which cows went into which bit of mincemeat right now. And I can tell you every step audited along the entire way, and it's going to cost me tens of millions of dollars to migrate to a blockchain. What benefit do I get from that? And I get that, right? Of going, if I can do it faster, I can do it cheaper with the incumbent technologies, why would I go with blockchain?
100%. And that was part of the problem, is that, you know, they try to deploy blockchain inside an environment where you already controlled all the data, in which case there's no need for it. Your old technology is already there, you control. The best use case I have seen for blockchain is in an environment where there isn't actually any central control of the data. So, despite my somewhat confused accent, some of you may recognize I'm originally from Ireland. And any who knows Ireland knows that we have a history of trying to avoid any law we can and being slightly dodgy, I'm afraid. That's just the reality. Sorry, my fellow countrymen. But, you know, for a decade, you could never rely on a logbook in a car. You could never rely on the service history in Ireland in a car. It was just completely fictitious. You know, if you didn't make it yourself, you'd have a mate down a garage who'd, you know, fill out the thing and stamp it for you. It was complete use. But they have deployed blockchain in that environment so that with a car, you get a blockchain that stores the history of it, because there's nobody who controls that central data, and relying on one person itself is wide open to manipulation. So I think that is a reasonable use case. But again, it's very narrow. You know, okay, I can buy my car and I'll get a blockchain that shows me exactly all of the service history of the car. And I can have confidence, because of the nature of blockchain, that has not been compromised, and that is a valid record of the servicing on the car. But the idea that blockchain was going to change the world, I never believed. I absolutely believe that AI is a complete game-changing technology.
I just want to change gears quickly.
Yep.
And I want to talk about data governance. Now, hot button, right?
Yeah.
So data governance, like when I think about it, you know, there's the idea of you've got all your policies, procedures, and then you've got the physical implementation of it. And you rarely see it done well in organizations. Go back to, I've just been hired as the head of data and AI. I'm going into my program and I want to get things started. Where should data governance come in my organization? Is it the precursor to me doing anything, or should it be established as I evolve my program? Should it be a latter stage? And I say that with the caveat of, I've seen a lot of money invested in building the policy and procedure, and very little of that translating into physically deployed governed assets. In your role, how do you think about introducing data governance into the organization, and when's the right time and how?
Brilliant. Not surprisingly, for the umpteenth time, two answers. First, I want to separate data architecture governance from data governance, because often we see you think it's bad working in ARB, but I have gone into one organization that effectively had an ARB for every domain of design. It had a security ARB, a data ARB, an integration ARB. You know, that's nonsense, right? Data architecture governance, the principle about the architecture of the data and how it sits in the ARB is just another domain of design. Do not replicate it. It's done there. If you take the other side of data governance, data quality management, and, you know, all of those aspects of more traditional data governance, I 100% agree. I have rarely seen it work. You might employ somebody at the top, and they have a lot of policies, etc. And they might arbitrarily decide, oh, you're the data owner and you're the data stewards. Half the time they don't do anything at all. But even when they do things, it's kind of just a ticket flick. I worked with one very large federal department who adopted that 15, 20 years ago. And because they were heavily unionized, you got an extra bonus in your pay if you became a data steward or a data owner. And they would say, oh, I'll become one of those. Yeah. And then they arbitrarily split the data model and say, okay, you've got customer, you've got this, you got that, you know, and they assigned it to people. And they didn't do it at all. They were just happy to get their extra 20% in their pay. We at Fragile to Agile, by the way, you've got the same thing replicating itself when it comes to process owners, and elsewhere. So we at Fragile is quite radical, and we only, even ourselves, have only brought 2 or 3 organizations to this level of maturity. We abolish all of those concepts, and we just create a capability owner.
Yeah.
And a capability owner owns the people, the process, the data, and the technology for that capability. Now, you get much more success in that model, because if I am the owner of the finance capability, I inherently get control of the data quality of the finance data. I'm far more likely to take that job seriously, because it's not only my extra 20% of my pay packet for being a data owner, it actually affects my day-to-day job. My ability to operate as the finance operator is fundamentally impacted by the quality of my data. You get better success that way. And I've never seen it perfect. I'll have to agree with you there, I'm afraid, Pete. I've never seen it done perfectly, but I've seen it done better. And when it works better is when you have that clear ownership of the data being related to the person's actual day-to-day job. So it's in their own interest to complete that data. There are challenges in this space. I worked with a bank 20, 25 years ago, and we started to implement these sort of very strict rules about, we will only take quality data into the organization. So put very heavy validation out in the front end, and started controlling. We're not going to take in this data unless we're 100% confident of its quality and get in there. That looked great from a technology perspective, and it looked great in theory. Unfortunately, the net result of it was the business started losing customers. Because if you became too insistent on, I'll use an example of a mortgage application, and you became too insistent on absolutely being 100% certain all the data they were giving you was right at the point of entry, they would walk away. Yeah. So we ended up having to lighten them up and taking known bad quality inside the organization, because otherwise, frankly, the other banks were taking it, so the bank was losing money. Losing opportunity for new customers. So I do appreciate this is a challenge to hide the data quality, but the biggest, I'm not telling you anything I'm sure you don't know here, Pete, but the biggest problem with data quality is, in fact, what we call swivel chair integration. Where the organization has not properly built integration between its 2 systems, and somebody's job is just sit there, take their swivel around, key it into the other system. And that's a recipe for absolute chaos. Yes. And that's what happens. And then having multiple stores for a particular data, most typically client or customer. And then I made absolutely clear which is the master, and you're only allowed updating the master, and it drives out to the slaves. So the way architecture can actually help this, because by the data architecture governance, absolutely the remit of enterprise architects to control. Data governance is not. We should try to make sure it's there. Any general person shouldn't sort of go, well, that's not my remit, so I don't care if it's not happening. Again, if we're developing roadmaps, we would always include, there's a piece for establishing data governance if it's not there, but it's not actually an enterprise architecture function beyond the data architecture governance itself to be in there. But if you set it up properly in the right place, the architecture's role is to eliminate the opportunities for data to go out. So, in our target state architecture, we should try to eliminate that swivel chair key. We should try to make sure that there is no updates happening to slave databases, or the worst case where you have 2 potential databases where things have been updated simultaneously, and then you have to do a 2-way match across them, and it becomes a nightmare.
Yeah. And so I see that as like where it falls down in a lot of organizations. You have kind of the architectural principles of how you want to govern your organization, your data assets, and that can be done very well, right? Beautiful definition, all the policies, I'm compliant on my policy level, but it falls down when it has to be physically implemented on, and I up until even now, the technologies available to be able to support the effective implementation of governance across your data assets and across the other associated assets in that has been pretty challenging. And so I know with some of the incumbent technologies that were in play for sort of the last 3 to 5 years, bloody hard to use, really expensive. We've seen a fair change in the last couple of years. And so just given, we're big in Unity Catalog with Databricks now. I think that's probably for us is the first price right, capability enabled solution where you can enforce governance principles across your data in an effective way. It's the first time we've really seen that come out. There's some other products out.
No, I was just going to say, you're particularly timely enough, you saw, but the market clearly agrees with you. It just became the first $1 billion data company. 100 billion, sorry, I beg your pardon, 100 billion with the latest round of investment. So yeah, the market agrees with you on Databricks. You're certainly there.
I reckon they're undervalued.
Okay.
When you look at some of the valuations of other companies, you look at the recent Figma IPO,
Yeah.
that popped big time. I think a few of them are coming out, and I think that Databricks, the way they run their company, the way they embed in organizations, they get everything in. They are the one lakehouse to rule them all. Bloody hard to remove them out of organizations, and they are just taking over at the moment. I mean, I know that they're moving in pretty largely on Snowflake's territory that they've built out, and so I'd be long on Databricks.
Now I should probably point that because I get in trouble otherwise around the video that Fragile to Agile is technology and product agnostic, and so we'll work with whatever organization, and we have no financial relationship with Databricks or anything like that. But just because we're agnostic doesn't mean we don't have an opinion.
Yeah.
And so we certainly would agree that it's certainly the leading at the moment. But our opinion, for example, on the leading CRMs changed 4 times in the last sort of 5 years or 10 years. So, but you're right, it's certainly the leading today. Yeah. Sorry, I set you off your question there. I didn't put you off what the actual question was.
Just more about like for the people that are, again, sort of either starting or scaling a program, and you get presented with that, like you're going to have to govern these assets, and there's varying levels of data security within organizations. How do you do that? Like you got the architectural principles that you can spend. I spent 11 years in consulting. I know there's a lot of money to be made from writing those principles right in there, but like let's jump across the fence and go, how do you pragmatically implement this within an organization? Do you do it first? Do you do it as you go along? Do you do it at the end? Do you do it kind of piecemeal? How would you advise people to?
I'd separate those two out again. So data architecture principle, I do think you need to get up front, and get that established, so that you're not building stuff which is going to cause the whole city to not work anymore, or, as we've seen far too often now. Recently, I think yesterday was the most recent one from iNet, but it happens all the time where you get these data leaks that cause companies irreparable, reputational damage. So you do need to get those architectural principles in place up front so that you're protecting yourself again. Today we go fast, safely in place. But in terms of the more longer term, harder aspects of data governance, like data quality management and getting those in place, now I'm very much a just in time. Get that done and say, try to go through and say, we're not going to do anything with AI or anything like that until we fix the entire data in all our organization and we have all this data governed. Well, by the time you finish that, your competitors already implemented 20 AI initiatives and you're out of business. Yeah. So no. So just to be clear, data architecture governance up front, the other aspects of data governance just in time.
Yeah. Awesome. Great. Look, I'll move on to the Fireside fires quickly now, because otherwise,
that sounds dangerous.
I'll keep your ear up all day, mate. And so,
well, that's the danger when you get two people like ourselves together.
So just to the first question here, and these are short answers.
Okay.
Short question, short answer.
Oh, challenge me. Okay. To ask an Irishman to speak short. Okay, I'll do my best.
If a CFO comes into you and says, I want to take 20% out of my budget or within an organization, what dies first?
Funny enough, it depends on the nature of the change. That's we just did an exercise for a Philippines company that had a brilliant name for it. Of course, it's not going to come to me now, but they do this regularly in the Philippines. They've got a clever name for it, but effectively what it is always plan for what happens if, the market collapses. What bare bones, that's what they call it, bare bones planning. And you would come to me, what can we ramp down to the very bare minimum of cost that we need if there's these sort of pressures on the outside? And even though I was actually speaking to their executive, I had to make the comment to which they liked. I said, funny enough, probably the first thing that goes is enterprise architecture. Well, it is about fundamental change and it's about making change. And if you're going to ramp down to survival mode, and I'm really talking about this survival mode type of model, well, then there is probably a case that says we're not going to be doing a lot of change for the last time. So we could probably, ramp down the enterprise architecture function. But that's not a platform per se, apart from the EA tool, which is not largely going to save you a huge amount of money to back that out. It is rare that we would get asked, I have to say, the first place you would go to save 20% is not the platforms, drive out the platforms. However, sometimes we have found organizations, and we can make very quick savings in some of them. I'll give 2 examples. A very large defense contractor where we went in and it was a similar exercise. They had to get through the valley of death for non-Australians here, there's a period for 2 years where the entire defence sector was really ramped down. Your brother would have experienced that, and so we had to wrap that to figure out what do we do to ramp down to bare minimums for 2 years, and then how do we make sure that we're in a position to ramp back up again quickly when that valley of death ends, when you go through. And there are a few things that you do. The first thing that we did there was actually run software that discovered that they had about 5,500 desktop apps out there they were paying licenses for. Now, they made a quite radical choice, which I've rarely seen the companies do, that rather than go through and find out who used what they used, they just shut them all off and see who shouted. But 3,500 never came back. They were just out there. They were paying licenses for that somebody had bought 5 years ago or 10 years ago for a program weren't being used. So there can potentially, in very large organizations, that's going to happen. Small ones, be some quick ones you can get there. But look at this other medical research company working currently in Victoria. Actually, they bought licenses for a core system that had this vision that they were going to use all of these components of the platform. But in fact, there are 3 modules they're simply not using.
Yeah.
And so you can find a quick way to say, okay, well, we need to ramp down. Let's just stop that. There's where you get into legals, because sometimes you can have lock-ins with the vendor for 3 years on the license that you can't change even if you're not using them. But the next place I would go is sorry, I was going to say shit. is the stuff we're not using in this organization that we can save. So, and you might get some percentages out of there that'll make your CFO happy. But typically we would go elsewhere for savings. If it's go down to bare bones and cut out platforms, it's going to be ramp down capability, drop service levels. So this bare bones, this Philippine company, we said, okay, your current SLA and IT service management is X number of days or hours. You're going to double that in bare bones. You're going to go much slower. You're going to not quite provide the same service level to the rest of the organization. So you can ramp down that, which enables you ramp down people.
I just want to double click on your assessment there of enterprise architecture. I know I was tongue in cheek or whatever, but there's two questions on this one. I'll fire them. One after the
other. Oh, sorry, I forgot the short part of the previous answer. I'll be short this time.
Now, will AI replace enterprise architects? How will the enterprise architecture community respond to what's coming?
Brilliant. First one, no, it's not going to replace it, but I like this catch. I've read in lots of other contexts. It's no different for EA. Now, EA is not going to replace EAs, but EAs working with AI are going to replace EAs who are not working with AI. You just have to learn how to get your job much quicker and become much more efficient as AI. So AI in enterprise architecture, and actually particularly in business architecture, more on the technology architecture side, has an opportunity for EAs to become much more efficient and much more effective. And so AI is going to impact our industry no different than any other, frankly. And it's an opportunity and a threat, which most of these things actually are when you come in there.
In light of the changes that are coming, how is the enterprise architecture community responding to this wave of innovation?
Again, various different levels of different people. The big bodies, in fact, you're going to name them TOGAF glacially, because they tend to be glacial organizations and they just rule really slowly. Business Architecture Guild, just slightly bodies moving a little bit more quickly to adopting AI in there. And then you'll have to look at various different enterprise architecture companies to have different levels of speed of adopting it. But my view is unambiguous that any enterprise architecture company that doesn't have a story to tell about how, at the very least, how it embeds AI when it's doing work for its clients. But of course, you need to embed AI in your own business, practice what you preach, but also to otherwise you're going to become less effective than your competitors. So AI is going to change our business directly. I'm not of the view that AI is going to destroy EA. Just like I've heard a similar thing about AI, potentially going to destroy the consulting business entirely. I don't think that's true either. There's still going to be a value of a human going in and talking and interpreting it. So it'll be human plus AI.
Yeah. Oh, I'm with you. I've got views on both of those. So one, I agree, like the enterprise architecture function is a mature function. And if you look at most organizations, they're informing material decisions. Like, do we invest in this? So like they're playing a role in the investment committee part of the business. And so is a business willing to take advice? Like a normal, 99.9% of businesses out there, right, that, are not product companies, tech companies, or consulting companies. They're not in a position, the senior decision-making layer at the moment is still, in my view, a long way away from taking advice from an agent or they need a human to sit across the table from them and inform them that we are going to spend X million dollars on this piece of technology or this direction because this is my view, and having done this for X number of years, you can get comfort in the fact that it's a human informing that decision. Now, that doesn't mean that EA can't get to that decision a lot faster through leveraging technologies, but it presents an enormous opportunity.
We call it gravitas. I could not agree more. And in fact, it's even a case for more junior EA. Some of our people who are more junior actually could give exactly the same recommendation as I or some of our more senior people. But they're not going to be listened to because they don't have the gravitas, the battle scars. You know, you've been there, you've done it in 25 places. And I think it's going to be a long time before AI agents are considered that same gravitas, you know.
And on your second one, again, having spent a long time in consulting, I don't agree that the industry is in an existential state. I think they're rubbing their hands together, going, great opportunity for us now to do more with less. They're partnerships, right? And so what do partnerships care about? They care about margin. And so they're going to see the opportunity now. And we spoke about this in a previous one about like the pyramid inverting somewhat.
Yes.
Where you have senior people that can be empowered by these capabilities. They'll still be able to, you might see a slowing down in revenue growth, but you'll see a fattening of margins because they'll be able to do more with less. And, you know, they're full of smart people, right? It's not like they're not seeing this coming and they're not responding to it. And so, again, I'm probably contrarian to a lot of people on that. You know, I'm actually optimistic for that world. I think it's just going to enhance the quality of what comes out of that world as well.
At the risk of sounding like a Luddite, I'm certainly not, because I work in this industry. I 100% agree with everything you said there. I do at a macro level worry, and it's going to be well beyond my career to worry about it won't affect my life. But I do worry in 20 or 30 years as we hollow out these entry-level jobs. And I look at, you know, as you're probably aware, the first jobs that are getting culled en masse are legal clerks, where their only job is to go and look at case history and effectively what large language models are being built for. I do worry what that means in 20 years or 30 years to the career path of lawyers. The existing lawyers and partners, as you say, are going to screen it in for a while because their margins are going to get, you know, they're going to replace those junior clerks with these people or LLMs, or, you know, they're just going to search and find the case precedent for them. But then where's the next generation of lawyers coming from? Because that is the career path. Yeah. So I say, I'm not being a Luddite here like that, but there are some way beyond, as said, my time to worry about it in my working career. But, you know, I do think in 20 or 30 years time, there's going to be some big challenges if we just hollow out this entry point, which is what it does have great capacity to do. But there's a question of just because we should doesn't mean, just because we can doesn't mean we should. There's a debate there for me about how much of that you do.
Wonderful. Well, look, mate, thank you very much for coming. I've thoroughly enjoyed the conversation. And look, I think there's an enormous amount to take away for our listeners in this, that in particular, as people in the data and AI field looking to, you know, start, scale, grow programs within their organizations, insight from the enterprise architecture world, and yourself as a, you know, senior, very successful technical leader, I think has been, you know, wonderful to hear from you. So thank you very much, mate.
And I'll finish what I would say, that I hope in the next 5 years or so you'll find more EAs that are easier to deal with as a community matures and we see more of what I will call the modern more agile EA. I hope you find it easier to work in organizations.
This goes out in every architecture review board I rock up to now. They're going to be prepared for us.
Very prepared.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for your time.
Awesome.
Thank you for inviting me. I thoroughly enjoyed it.